All right, everyone. So I want to introduce you all to Professor Danilo Mandić. I was first introduced to Danilo Mandić, I want to say back in 2005. I first saw him on TV supporting OSSI in Belgrade, Serbia. He is a student activist and eventually went on to Princeton and studied there, and then studied at Harvard and earned his PhD there. He is currently teaching at the college and the extension school and has been a mentor and huge influence in my life. I would not have ever joined HESA or become a student activist at all if I hadn't been heavily influenced by Danilo Mandić throughout my entire life. There is no bigger fan than me, and you should buy all of his books. I just got the Syrian refugee crisis book, the hardcover, of course, and I recommend that you all buy it. I'll put the links in the chat. But without further ado, my personal hero, my favorite professor of all time, and the person I look up to most, Dr. Danilo Mandić. Thank you.
God, Amina, people will think that I bribed you for such a generous introduction. I think we'll have to sign like a financial non-disclosure agreement, the way bureaucracies work these days, just to make sure that nobody misunderstands. That's very kind of you. I'm really, that's maybe a little too even flattering, because now it raises the expectations a little, maybe too high, and then disappointment is going to be inevitable. But we'll try to talk about refugees a little bit. Can I have the share screen function? Or should we just talk like this? We can also, if the group would prefer, we can also just do it as a Q&A, but I have also a few slides if you want to kind of.
You should be.
I just made you the co-host.
There you go.
Should we may I ask the group in the chat, would you prefer me to go on for a while and then we have a conversation, or maybe we can just jump right in and see what people would like to talk about? What's the normal procedure?
The normal procedure is to do like a slideshow PowerPoint presentation, and then we finish with a Q&A.
Okay. So does that work? Can you see the screen? Okay, great. So let me try to say a few things about, I'll give you a quick overview of forced migration globally, and then I'm going to give you kind of five, we'll see how much time we have, but I wanted to give you five kind of parameters to think about, five features, five things to know about refugees, I guess, is a good way to understand it. This is a photograph of a Syrian refugee during the 2015-16 Middle Eastern refugee wave into Europe, being moved through a barbed wire. And what's interesting about this photograph is, as I discovered through an acquaintance of mine who is in the photography profession, who spoke to the photographer who made this photograph, which got a tremendous amount of circulation and publicity and mobilized an enormous amount of humanitarian attention and energy. I think the photograph won kind of best photograph of the year in the photojournalism profession. And the funny thing I discovered from this photographer is that this was actually a staged photograph. They asked the family to hold the child in a particular angle and to bring him back and forth across the barbed wire in order to catch this very moving image. And it's a reminder of how difficult it is sometimes to penetrate the superficial, the kind of the shiny object of the media, and the stereotypes that we have about refugees, notably that they are passive, that they are victims, that they are pity cases, that they are vulnerable. All of those things are true, obviously true in a certain context, but in another context, we forget refugee agency, we forget the context that made them refugees to begin with, which I will touch on here in a second. So just to give you, I won't belabor this too much, but just to give you a sense of the scale of this, we're looking at something like 100 million plus forced migrants globally. the overwhelming majority of forced migrants are what we call internally displaced persons, meaning they did not cross an international border and therefore are not, it is not possible for them to have any asylum or sanctuary or refugee protection under the Refugee Convention, which is the standard humanitarian law regulating refugee questions. So most forced migrants are IDPs, and because they did not cross an international border, they are still within the territory where the problem that displaced them is. Due to the fact that they haven't crossed the international border, they don't qualify even in principle for refugee protection. And then you have a smaller subset of the 100-something million. You have something like 20 to 30 million who did cross an international border, and they are what we call convention refugees. Of the 30 million, or 20 to 30 million who did cross an international border, less than 1% of them are ever going to get resettled through the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, the main organization globally dealing with this problem. Less than 1% on average yearly, and it's been that way decades. And so the resettlement system is broken. In the meantime, 80-something% of them who did cross an international border are in neighboring countries, neighboring the ones that they fled. I won't surprise you when I tell you that the neighboring countries from the ones that they fled are low income, underdeveloped, what used to be called third world countries. We don't call this anymore, right? These are not the kind of societies that can easily support a refugee infrastructure, and yet 85% of the world's refugees are in such societies. The proverbial first world, right, accounts for a marginal, very small, extremely modest subset of a subset of a subset of forced migrants globally in terms of who is hosting them. And so although a lot of the kind of fancy countries are screaming bloody murder about the number of refugees that they have taken and are constructing elaborate restrictionist policies to block any refugee movements, the truth is that those fancy countries account for a minuscule percentage of the refugees being hosted in the world. The overwhelming majority of refugees are in poor, underdeveloped, conflict-prone, very unstable societies where violence and collective violence and war and what I'm going to call the force factor is still a significant problem. So you got, in terms of origin societies, in terms of source societies, where refugees come from, obviously you're looking at the Middle East, you're looking at sub-Saharan Africa, including Central Africa in particular. More recently, you're looking at Ukraine, which has generated millions of refugees, the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And more recently, there's an anomaly on the left-hand side of my map here, and that is the Western Hemisphere. It is the first time ever, in fact, since the UNHCR has been keeping track of this stuff, it is the first time ever, and in that sense, we are kind of living in historic times, and we should think about what that means. It is the first time ever that one of the top 10 host societies in the world and one of the top 10 source societies, refugee source societies in the world, is in the Western Hemisphere due to the catastrophe of Venezuela. Venezuela, as you know, is a very, we don't have time to go into it, but millions of people have moved into Colombia and into other societies. Many of them transition through Central America, and some of them even make it into the United States. But that is truly a break with tradition, because for decades, the Western Hemisphere was just not a significant contributor either on the side of source societies or on the side of destination societies, even less when it comes to refugee questions. And that has changed in the last 5 to 10 years, in the last decade. And this is a window of opportunity, in a sense, for America as a major kind of actor globally to reconsider refugee governance and global governance, right? You got Afghanistan as a major source society with something like 2.8 million displaced. You have Venezuela, I mentioned, with over 5 million displaced. You have Syria, the Syrian civil war. Amina was kind enough to advertise my book about the Syrian refugee crisis. And those of you who are interested in Syria and the broader Middle East, I'm happy to come back to that question. But Syrians, you got between 6 and 7 million Syrian refugees, meaning convention refugees who got out of Syria, in addition to which you have another 7, possibly million Syrians who are displaced internally within Syria, about whom you don't hear very much, right? In terms of host societies, we have to mention Turkey, because Turkey is, in absolute terms, the greatest host society in the world and has been so for a number of years. Regardless of what we think of Erdogan, regardless of what we think of the Turkish regime, which has all the defects we can speak about, it is also true that nobody has done more in terms of humanitarian industry, in terms of investment, in terms of creating the infrastructure of refugee camps than Turkey, which, because of the curse of geography, it's close to Syria and it's close to the Middle East, has a tremendous amount, the biggest in absolute term number of refugees of all countries live in Turkey. In per capita terms, we can talk about countries like Lebanon. Lebanon is a very small country, but in per capita terms has something like between 40 and 60%, depending on how people count categories like the Palestinians. So estimates vary, but a conservative estimate, something like 40% of the population of Lebanon is refugees. And I'm sure many of you came to this talk expecting we talk about Israel and Gaza, and I'm happy to do that, very happy, in fact. Maybe in the Q&A, if somebody would like to, we can return to this. But consider what it means for Lebanon to have already 40% of its population are refugees from various refugee waves, some of them decades ago, some of them more recently, on top of which you have the Palestinian catastrophe happening. And so that's where we are. We have South Sudan. I didn't go into Africa. We can talk about South Sudan. We can talk about the South Sudan separatist episode, which is a major generator of refugees to this day, which has not adequately been, which is destabilizing a lot of the political processes in Eastern Africa. A major host society like Uganda, a young society where the median age is something like 15. That's the median age. That means half the population of the country is under 15 years of age. For that society to take 1.5 million refugees is quite a challenge. And so this is the geographic kind of distribution. There's all kind of various nuances that we can talk about, like statelessness and so on. But let me move to my 5 points real quick. So these are kind of 5 things. Let's think about this as kind of 5 things an educated person should know about, educated person should think about when it comes to refugees. So number 1, you want to think about what is the relevance of the migratory feature of forced migrants? Is the act of migrating the key thing about refugees? And I will argue not. I will argue that, in fact, the key thing about forced migrants is that they are forced, not that they are migrants, and that we shouldn't pay so much attention to the migratory feature. Number 2, we want to think about force factor timing. Force factor refers simply to, it's just a fancy way of saying the thing that pushed them out of the country, the reason that they fled. Let's just call that the force factor. Is it a death squad in Rwanda or in Burundi slaughtering the Hutus or slaughtering the Tutsis, but depending on which side of the Rwanda-Burundi border you are on? Is it artillery shelling, indiscriminate artillery shelling of Russians of the Donbas region? Is it loss of livelihood due to mining around an area that has been played, right? Is it bombing in the Syrian civil war, right? What is the force factor? And so the question of the force factor timing is, when exactly does the forcing happen? When exactly does the force factor that forced these migrants out happen, and how durable is it? As it turns out, that's a key question. Number 3, oh, sorry, I messed this up, didn't I? This should be, hold on a second. Can I do this? Yes, I can, because of the miracle of technology. What this should say, and I hope it's not also in my subsequent slides, my 3rd point over here, if you can just, I'm going to put it up here, is transnational force factor. Okay, so just scratch. So number 3 is something I'm going to call transnational force factor, which refers to the fact that most refugees are fleeing force factors which are not entirely internal affairs. Force factors look like they're internal affairs, and we want to believe politicians who say that they're internal affairs. And for nationalist reasons, we would like to believe that they're internal affairs. But in reality, and in kind of the sociological, empirical matter of fact, most force factors are transnational. And I'm going to try to explain what that means. Number 4, you want to think about integration. What does refugee integration look like? Most people think that integration is formal, that integration involves the formal act of getting citizenship, of getting a passport, of getting a labor permit, of somehow being recognized by the local authorities, if not the national authorities of the society where you are, and becoming a part of that society from the state's perspective formally. And what we should move away from that towards an understanding that most refugee integration, as it happens in the world that we live in, is informal and happens despite state-sanctioned measures, despite the formalism, despite the bureaucracies, but is nevertheless very, very real. Most refugees are integrated, given the situation, in the societies that they find themselves one way or another, including through black markets and smuggling, for example. And even though they don't have the formal, even though they don't tick the formal boxes, they are nevertheless informally integrated, and we need to understand that integration. And number 5, repatriation. When refugees return to the societies they've been displaced from, what does that mean? Does that mean success? Does that mean the end of their refugeedom? Does that mean that the original force factor has disappeared? Quite the contrary. As I'll try to tell you, a lot of our optimism about repatriation, especially mass repatriation, is premature, and we need to move away from that towards an understanding that repatriation is not an end of the forced migration process, but maybe just part of a phase, maybe just part of a cyclical forced migration process, including by generating new forced migration. A lot of repatriation that happens on a mass scale prematurely has the capacity to generate new violence and to displace more people. Okay. So let me try to quickly, let me get rid of this now. How does one get rid of this? Just give me a second. Like that. There we go. So let me try to quickly run through these, and then maybe we can open it up to discussion. So number 1, as I said, most people think that the way to think about refugees is that they're just a subcategory of migrants in general, that they're just a kind of special idiosyncratic type of migrant. And this bleeds into sometimes what's called what we can call a migratory essentialism. You know how there's different essentialisms that want to take one category of people or another and just identify one feature about them and say, this is the single most important feature about them. This is their essence. And so many of you, I'm sure, encountered things like there's class essentialism in the social sciences. The Marxian tradition is often accused of this, where the only thing that matters about you is your class position, and nothing else matters. Your gender, your race, nothing else matters. There's a racial essentialism, which is also very popular recently in the social sciences, which basically looks just at people's race and neglects everything else and thinks that race is your essence and determines everything about it. So there is a kind of migratory essentialism as regards refugees that many people fall into, which basically says the key thing we want to understand about refugees is the migration itself, the movement from point A to point B, and how did it happen, and how didn't it happen, and why did it happen, and things like that. And the reference categories for comparative work and comparing refugees, more often than not, is other migrants. And so refugees are reduced to this kind of relational category, a kind of relational understanding, where ordinary unforced migrants are the kind of benchmark, and then refugees are this residual relational category, and we talk about how they are different from the ordinary unforced migrants. This is at some level understandable, because in the United States, for example, it's very understandable because we are the nation of immigrants, as the old tenet goes, and we have a tremendous scholarship on migration, not just globally, but for the United States especially. The United States is a tremendously successful immigrant integration society. And because you have this gigantic, stupendous literature on integration and immigration, ordinary immigration, right? Labor migration and the like, there is a temptation to just take refugees as a kind of residual and try to fit them in, try to kind of squeeze them into that pigeonhole, as if the most important thing about them is their migration, and as if they have a lot of commonality with ordinary migrants. But when you start thinking about it, what do forced migrants have in common with tourists? What do they have in common with labor migrants? What do they have in common with exchange students? What do they have in common with second and third generation migrant children in the United States, right? The answer ends up being not very much. Instead, forced migrants and refugees have a lot more in common, as it turns out, with trafficking victims who didn't migrate anywhere, prisoners who didn't migrate anywhere, prisoners of war, for example, who were not migrated anywhere, sweatshop indentured servitude victims in Southeast Asia, for example, who were not migrated anywhere, victims of war and civilians in war zones, right? Those are the proper reference categories because refugees have a lot more in common with those categories than they do with ordinary visa holders and tourists and other migration categories. This isn't to say that ordinary migrants don't suffer tremendous ordeals. Of course, they suffer tremendous ordeals. I'm an ordinary migrant as well, and I immigrated into this country, and many of you are. So this isn't a story about competitive victimhood, and it's not a story about who suffers more, who suffers less. It's just a story about how the specific thing about refugees that we need to understand is that they have this force factor, that something about them was involuntary in the displacement, right, as opposed to voluntary, that in a certain sense, though not entirely, they didn't have as much choice as ordinary migrants do in migrating, and that many aspects of refugees, such as their integration dynamics, such as their levels of trauma, 30% of refugees have clinical depression, and another 30%, which overlaps largely with that 30%, have what we call PTSD. That's an order of magnitude higher than for ordinary migrants or for the general population in general. And that fact alone, right, the fact that refugees are special in that sense, influences everything else that we like to talk about in migration literature. Where they integrate, how they integrate, do they form ethnic enclaves, don't they form ethnic enclaves, how successful are they at second generation income, social mobility, how about a whole slew of gender role reversals in refugee families versus gender role reversals in ordinary migration families. A whole slew of questions we want to know are not going to get answered very well if we use other migrants as a reference category, because they are not like other migrants as regards trauma, for example, and trauma has tremendous impact on all those things I just listed because coping mechanisms for trauma determine different kinds of behavior and different patterns than anything we see in the migration literature. In contrast, we could get a lot more done if we kind of shift our thinking away from the other migrants and to start to understand that refugees are more closely, better understood as constituencies closer to the ones I mentioned, like trafficking victims and prisoners of war, civilians in war zones, civilians affected by collective violence, right? So instead of what is the standard approach, and that is this thing called the forced unforced migration continuum, where you imagine a kind of continuum like a scale, and over on one side is the refugee who has zero, who is completely forced, who didn't choose to migrate at all. An extreme example is a slave, right? Slavery today, of course, is very prominent. As my colleague Orlando Patterson in the sociology department has been teaching for years, we have more slaves today in absolute terms than we did at the peak of the transatlantic slave trade in absolute terms, although not in relative terms, right? And so that population of tens of millions of slaves is actually a much better reference category for understanding refugees because they share a lot of those processes, right, than a lot of the unforced migrants. But what do we have instead? We have this forced unforced migration continuum where people imagine, okay, on the one side is people who just get transported completely against their will. And then on the other end of the spectrum is tourists who choose completely agentically to go somewhere, or people who are looking for wage differentials, like labor migrants who travel for jobs. Academic jobs, for example, are on the other end of the spectrum, and that's your continuum, right? We need to move away from that, where the least common denominator is the migration, towards an understanding of refugees on a forced migration, forced immobility continuum. What does that mean? That's a continuum where on the one hand you have slaves, and on the other hand you have people forbidden from leaving. You have people who are captives, for example, in war zones, who are unable to evacuate, who are unable to move even though they want to, because, for example, there's a death squad keeping them, blocking the village and keeping people hostage, right? So we want to move to a continuum where it's not tourists on one side, refugees on the other. We want to move to a continuum where it's hostages on one side and refugees on the other. Okay. So the most important thing about refugees is not that they're migrants, it's that they're forced. Number two, what about this force factor timing? So the problem is, I'm telling you here kind of the conventional wisdom approach to these problems, and then I'm telling you a better way to think about it, right? So the conventional wisdom problem with these kind of way to think about this is that the force factor is the immediate kind of preceding event that refugees themselves talk about when explaining their movement, when explaining their displacement. And this is problematic because we slide into a kind of trigger reductionism, which confuses causes and triggers, which conflates the particular event that may or may not have displaced a refugee. There's a particular terrorist bombing. There's a particular airstrike on a village. There's a particular death squad moving on a particular day through a given village, right? But we need to understand that that is a part of a process of, for example, ethnic cleansing, of, for example, insurgency and counterinsurgency, killing each other over a great number of years, of a national liberation struggle that has a host state resisting it and so on, right? And so often when we reduce the reasons that refugees left to a single event, we forget about that broader force factor, which is the true force factor of the particular civil war dynamic or the particular separatist movement or the particular nationalist uprising or whatever it may be, right, that is displacing them. And so to understand context is very, very important, but we fall into this trigger reductionism for understandable reasons, because we want to know when 1 million refugees show up at our door, what's causing this? And then it's very tempting to look at the thing that just happened immediately preceding this 1 million people wave, right? Never mind that they might have been trickling in over a period of years in smaller volumes, building up to that 1 million that we suddenly notice. Never mind that the war there had been raging for years prior to any refugee outflow, with the displacement being restricted internally among IDPs, right? Never mind all that. We like to assume that when we see high volumes of refugees, there is the force factor intensifying and perhaps peaking, because if it's that many refugees, the force factor must be there. In fact, it turns out in empirical work, as best we know, that's not true at all. It wasn't true for the Holocaust. It's very interesting to read the Jewish refugee dynamics of the 1930s, prior to the war, and then during the war, and then during the final solution when it commenced later. The Holocaust was very processual, as you know, and it would have been a tremendous mistake to equate the force factor with peak refugee Jewish outflow, because of course peak refugee Jewish outflow happens when? In the 1930s, prior to the war. Because the Nazis, of course, were the kind of force factor where official Nazi policy was to expel Jews, and then official Nazi policy became forced containment. What I mentioned, forced immobility, this concept I mentioned in the previous slide. So they moved from intentionally forcefully pushing them out and creating refugees to a policy of forbidding them from leaving and slowly moving into the death camps and everything else that I'm sure you know very well. And so it's an illustration of how even that, the kind of paradigmatic refugee case of history, does not have an easy match between the force factor on the one side, force factor intensity on the one side, force factor timing and duration on the one side, and refugee volume on the other side. Let alone if we look at Syria, if we look at Afghanistan, if we look at these other cases, which were not so cataclysmic, even they have a tremendous discrepancy between refugee volume and force factor timing when it starts, right? So we need to avoid this situation where, oh, I'm not seeing a lot of Syrian refugees recently. Not this year, not last year, not 3 years ago. So the Syrian civil war must be calming down. Oh, I haven't heard anything about Afghan refugees since the Kabul airlift of 2 or 3 years ago. Therefore, the Afghanistan violence level must be going down. Those are all pernicious mistakes, right? They're understandable because we in the fancy countries, in the destination societies, only see refugee volumes because those are the people who come to us and then we notice. And it's much more difficult, including because of the fog of war, including because belligerents are concealing the dynamics of the battlefield, including because of propaganda, including because of nationalist biases. For a whole host of reasons, the force factor is hidden, it's far away, it's over there, it's in South Sudan, it's in Eritrea, it's in Tigray region where Ethiopia killed many more people than the Russians did in Ukraine, right? Those things are far away, and we don't understand them very well. And so we often treat the refugees who come to us as a proxy, as a kind of rough approximation of how that war is going over there, and that's a terrible idea. A better way to think about it is, first of all, to be very careful to distinguish triggers from causes, from contextual causes, from catalysts. Those of you who are in the political science, sociology field know how difficult that is and know how tricky that is, but it's necessary. And we hope that our friends, the journalists, and our friends, the public commentators, would pay a little more attention to that as well, right? And another thing to understand about refugees is that refugee waves come with a lag. There are extremely significant lag effects between when the violence is at its peak, when the persecution is at its peak, when the ethnic cleansing is at its peak, when the, in extreme cases, genocide, right, is at its peak. It goes up and down and there's ebbs and flows, but usually there's a peak. And the refugee wave is never correlated with that peak, as best we know, case after case. There is always some kind of lag, and there is always some kind of lag after the force factor starts to kick in, right? And we have to understand this lag, and we have to allow for the fact that the persecution may start in year X, and you see refugee volume only beginning in year X plus 3, and you see refugee volume only peaking in X plus 10, and that's normal. So we would like them to be exactly simultaneous. They're not. Okay. Number 3. Whoa, what's going on? Number 3. How am I doing on time? Do we have another? I'll run through these. The force factor is transnational. What do I mean by that? We fall into this trap, a lot of us, of what Andreas Wimmer, a famous sociologist colleague of mine, called methodological nationalism. That is the assumption that the world is kind of divided into nation states, and that the stuff that happens internally within nation states is one thing, and then the stuff that happens externally is foreign policy and international relations, and that's another thing, and those two things are separate research agendas, separate journals, separate conferences, separate conversations that we have, right? That's a tremendous mistake. As it turns out, the force factor, state by state, that you would like to look at, right, is significantly transnational. Why? Because endogenous contributors to displacement are almost always connected to foreign intervention, military foreign intervention, economic foreign intervention, diplomatic foreign intervention. Almost all the civil wars of today, right? Or the insurgencies, or the separatist guerrilla struggles, or they can be sectarian, they can be ethnic, they can be racial, whatever you like. They look like they're internal, endogenous completely. Oh, you want to understand the Syrian refugee thing? It's something about Syria. It's something going on inside Syria. It's the Alawites and the and the Sunni Shia thing, and then this branch of the right. It's something internal to Syria and the Assad regime and its opposition, right? That's the common sense intuition, which is in fact wrong, because if you look at the Syria civil war, it is a transnational force factor through and through. Turkey is involved through the al-Nusra Front inside Syria. Russia is bombing Syria, determining fatefully critical junctures in the war. Iran is involved in Syria. America, under the John Kerry Obama administration, deeply involved in Syria, supporting the moderate opposition, so-called, as people remark. It's the moderate terrorists at the expense of the extreme terrorists that the United States foreign policy was involved in, right? France is bombing Syria in multiple episodes, displacing tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of Syrians, right? And so to understand the Syrian refugee crisis, you need to understand that it's not just about stuff going on inside Syria. It's a story of interventionist powers from around the region and indeed around the globe, right? And so we need to return to this famous sociologist called R.D. Zolberg, who identified this very early on, and in his work demonstrated that the major causes of refugee waves, including revolutions and coups and reconfigurations of political communities and separatism, irredentism, and all these major causes driving refugees today are almost always transnational when it comes to looking at who is at, right? You need weapons. Where do those weapons come from? They come from weapons smuggling from externally, for example. They come from weapons donations of patron states and major governments around the world that are supplying one belligerent as opposed to the other, and pouring oil on the fire, increasing forced migration, right? That doesn't happen internally. That's an external, internal dynamic. It's a transnational dynamic, right? Embargoes and economic strangulation and economic statecraft are tremendously important aspects of force factors in countries like Yemen, in countries like Sudan, in countries like Eritrea, Ethiopia, in a whole series of countries I could list for you now, in the former Yugoslav cases, in the cases of Venezuela, of course, economic statecraft, right, from outside, right, different countries blockading, sanctioning, arms embargoes, right, are an integral part of the explanation of who is leaving and when and how, right? So we need to understand that the force factor, even though it looks endogenous, is actually exogenous as well. We need to pay attention to the interventionist powers involved in creating refugees. And we need to move towards the Zolberg thesis, to return to it, as it were, because it's a major tenet of the forced migration literature, right? And we need to move away from this methodological nationalism. Okay. Number 4. So what does integration mean? And how do we interpret refugee integration? Well, I can't tell you how many refugee books I read, which are not really about refugees. They are actually about the society that is hosting them. So it looks like a book about refugees, Congolese refugees in America, but actually it's a book about America. It's about American values and American reception and the flaws of the American immigration system and American history and American population and its nativism and American sympathy and America's flaws and how can we correct America. That's what the book is actually about. So we have this problem in our understanding, which we might call solipsism, and that is that we are not really looking at the forced migrants themselves. We are looking at them as an occasion to talk about ourselves, to talk about our societies, and particularly the Western European, America, Australia, advanced liberal democracies, which I stressed at the beginning are a very small contributor to the refugee hosting. But nevertheless, 90% of the literature is about refugee integration into the societies that in fact, resettle a minuscule subset of them, right? This leads to what Fassan, a famous French analyst, called the compassion, repression, moral economy, where we are the benevolent, altruistic benefactors who are out of generosity and out of magnanimity, opening up our hearts and borders to these people. And this looks like a fantastic kind of the point of the compassion repression literature. Compassion repression refers to this idea that basically the humanitarian moralistic impulse, which looks at refugees as pity cases who deserve altruism and humanitarian aid, looks like a fantastic thing, but that actually it's the flip side of the repression framework. The repression framework that says, look how ungrateful they are after everything we've done for them. The repression framework which says, yes, since we took them out of altruistic magnanimity into our societies, we did them a favor, we gave them a gift. And so how dare they have these views about politics? How dare they have these views about women? How dare they have these views about Christianity? How dare they fit into the labor market or not fit into the labor, right? There's this tendency to make refugee rights conditional because the way we formulated the problem is we, the society that is taking them, is the benchmark, and we are doing this tremendous magnanimous gift, and so they have to conform, have to meet certain criteria, have to prove their worthiness of the gift that we gave them. This compassion repression problem is very pernicious because, as you know, putting yourself in the position of a benevolent benefactor is actually putting yourself in a morally superior position. And treating them as pity cases obscures the actual question at hand, which is political obligations that we have to refugees. It's a big difference between giving someone a gift out of altruism and giving something that you owe them. So asylum is a political right that is not conditional on them learning the language, on them being the right religion, on them fitting into your mores, on them liking your culture. All of that stuff, though we would love it, is actually says nothing about their asylum rights. Either we believe in their asylum rights or we don't. If we don't, that's fine, and we should say so. But there's this danger that we are singing a kind of self-congratulatory song of how wonderful we are, all the while repressing them on grounds that they don't deserve to be repressed. Okay, so that's the compassion repression problem we see in a lot of countries, and is one of the many reasons that the integration stuff is difficult to talk about, right? Integration formally is extremely rare. That is to say, the vast majority of refugees never get not only citizenship, but any kind of document like a labor permit or a transitory permit, right? The vast majority of them never get even that. And so you're looking at a very, very small subset of a subset of refugees if you focus on formal integration only, as unfortunately we have a tendency to do. As I mentioned to you, IDPs are integrating not in some third society, because IDPs are, by the way, they're inside. They're still inside South Sudan. They're still inside Syria. They're still under the Taliban in Afghanistan, right? They are still in Venezuela and displaced. What is their integration story? Do you think when people are displaced that they just roll over and die? No, they are displaced from an urban locality in Venezuela, in a rural locality in Venezuela, and they integrate there, if necessary, informally. So the point here is we need to move away from integration as a formal, bureaucratic, state-centered process towards a more sociological understanding of integration, which includes such things as black markets, which includes such things as self-sufficiency through criminal activity, which includes such things as informal cultural integration. A good example is the neighborhood of Little Mogadishu in Nairobi, Kenya, where Somali and not just Somali, but predominantly Somali refugees have de facto integrated into Kenya and into Nairobi. They're there. They're part of that society. They are part of the youth culture. They transformed the youth culture of Nairobi. They're doing hip hop. They're doing art. They're doing, Nairobi youth culture is impossible to understand without these little Mogadishu ghetto refugees, right? They are part of the economy. They are profitable and self-sufficient. They are hiring locals. Refugee Somalis hiring locals inside Nairobi, local Kenyans working for the refugees, because refugees are extremely entrepreneurial that way, right? They are part of the economy. They're part of the culture. They're part of the society. They have schools that they organize. They have, right? On the other hand, they are formally forbidden from integrating. They're not allowed to be outside camps. They're not allowed labor permits. They're not allowed any steps towards citizenship, most of them, right? You're not allowed to be outside of a Kenyan refugee camp like the one in Dadaab. And yet, despite the formalisms, despite the bureaucracy, right? Despite the top-down state policy that refugees are criminals if they are even outside of the camp, let alone if they set up shop in Little Mogadishu, right? Despite all that, the reality of refugee agency is there. They integrate, even though it's informal, even though it's considered corruption and criminality and so on. And so, of course, Nairobi and the authorities in Kenya know this full well and are tolerating it. And at the same time, they're kind of singing the song of, we will never keep them. They are just here temporarily. They're not allowed to be here. They're just in a camp. They are going to repatriate. We are going to, the war is going to be over in Somalia and they're going to go back, for example. That's the official narrative of most host societies, whether it's Jordan, whether it's Colombia, anybody, right? The governments tend to be restrictionist and nativist, pandering to the public opinion and officially saying, no, 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 this is just temporary. These refugees are not going to get citizen. They're not really here. But in fact, they're really here and they are part of your society and they're contributing to the economy. And sometimes that contribution through the corruption and black market is an embarrassment because it reveals your own corrupt state apparatus, as is the case in Kenya, and reveals your own level of graft and bribery and all the other things that enable gray market and black market refugee economies to flourish in urban settings outside refugee camps, right? In places like Little Mogadishu. And so if you look around the world, refugee integration is rampant. It's just not the kind of thing that we imagine when we think about integration, because we think of it overly formalistically, and we need to move away from that and to understand it in a more informal setting where you have informal integration models of high levels of integration despite the state apparatus, not because of it. Finally, repatriation optimism. What do we mean here? It's kind of intuitive to think, okay, you got this tragedy I just told you, you got 100 million people displaced. What's the solution? Everyone asks me all the time, what's the solution? What's the solution? And sometimes I like to say part of the problem is that you're asking me this question, because of course, when you have systemic issues, not just like surface manifestations, but really systemic problems that have been going on for a very long time before you've even been born, there is no quick fix. And so there is this, what I like to call the Kennedy School mentality, which is, you know how in the Kennedy School, my colleagues work in the way that if you can't say the solution to the problem in the same breath as the problem itself, you're considered irrelevant. And so if you can't blurt out a solution, right? We want a solution that is just 30 seconds, and then I take 2 Tylenols and go to sleep, and in the morning, the refugee crisis is over. So the beginning of wisdom as regards repatriation is to understand that it is not a quick fix solution. The UNHCR has sometimes, and God bless the UNHCR, I am very happy the UNHCR exists, and the UNHCR is one of these organizations that gets a lot of undue criticism because it gets blamed for everything. But the UNHCR's mandate is very modest, and they are at the mercy of warlords in various societies blocking, let alone at the mercy of the Security Council, which is blocking them nonstop. So in a certain sense, the UNHCR's hands are tied behind their backs, and it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't activity that they are doing every single day. And hundreds of their workers are getting killed every single day, for example, in Israel, right? And so the UNHCR has a really hard time. And one of the ways the UNHCR deals with this tremendously hard time that it has is emphasizing repatriation as a panacea. That's what they do best. Oh, 50,000 Afghans repatriated, fantastic. Oh, 30,000 millions of Ukrainians repatriated into Ukraine. fantastic, right? And at some level, of course, it is. And at some level, we want to think about repatriation as one of the very important, not to belittle it, very important goals and ideals that we need to strive towards. However, it's a tremendous mistake to treat repatriation as the end of the force factor. You see, somebody can come home, and what are they coming back to? Well, maybe they're coming back to rubble. How about you don't have a home anymore? What used to be your home is rubble. How about instead of you coming back to your home has been taken by somebody else while you were away. And the property rights associated with your home are not going anywhere because the government is still in disarray and possibly even still fighting an insurgency or war and has no interest in giving refugees back their property rights. How about then? How about if the people who occupied your former residence are also themselves refugees displaced from some other conflict? How about you come back and the locals look at you with tremendous suspicion and ethnic hostility and maybe want to do violence to you because you came back? How about in mass repatriation, when tens of thousands of people come, they are perceived as thieves of jobs, and they are perceived as traitors, and they are perceived as problematic characters because while we, for example, have been dying here for a decade, you've been spending in a luxurious society abroad in Turkey, for example, and now you would like to come back and have equal rights? You can see how nativist public opinion in the locality where they are repatriating can itself be a danger to the returnees. And this is on one end of the spectrum. This results in violence and death and murder of returnees. And the literature on forced migration is very clear that I can show you case study after case study of refugees returning and then getting murdered for the fact that they have returned on massive scales. I mentioned Burundi. One of the big untold stories of the Rwanda genocide is that tens of thousands of people were slaughtered in Burundi upon returning by Tutsi elites inside Burundi, right? You have the asymmetry in right. The victims of the genocide in Rwanda were, of course, Tutsi, but the victims and most of the refugees from Burundi, of course, are Hutu, and Tutsis are the perpetrators, right? So there's that difference. But rest assured that if you look at Afghanistan, if you look at all the major, right, all those returnees from Afghanistan coming back into Taliban territory, for example, how big of a success story is that really? Pashtun tribal Afghans coming back and are now under the jurisdiction of the Taliban. Can we really call that a success? I'm not sure that we can call that a success. And if I'm a woman in under Taliban rule especially, I'm not sure I'm prepared to call that a success, especially if you take into account that their repatriation was not entirely voluntary. See, we talk about repatriation as a wonderful thing and as a wish list because we assume that repatriation is somebody wants to go back, as many do, and then they choose to go back. In reality, you look at Afghanistan, millions of Afghans repatriated. Why? Because Pakistan pushed them out. Because Pakistan made their lives very, very difficult and had a state-driven policy to massively force, as it were, repatriation. And so we need to move away from repatriation as a wonderful thing, which it could be and is, but under a lot of conditions, towards an understanding that a lot of repatriation is forced, or at least is not entirely voluntary, and is closer to deportation or right? There's a lot of repatriation is just deportation. And we need to understand that as well, okay? Finally, one final point about repatriation. We look at returnee numbers and would like to say, oh, great, if they're coming back in large numbers, that must mean the situation stabilized. That must mean that the force factor is not as intense as it used to be. That must mean, because after all, why would they return if the force factor is still as bad or perhaps worse than it was before, right? In fact, that's another misconception, because as it turns out, you see spikes in returnee volume preceding more displacement and escalations of violence. That is to say, when you see, like in real time, right, not retrospectively, but in real time, where the journalists and the humanitarian industry and students and Scott and those of us, right, who pay attention to this stuff, we tend to react from day to day in real time by seeing some spike in returnees and assuming that this must mean a bright future in the short term. And in retrospect, right, looking at the data across the society, across the cases that we have, we notice that actually more often than not, such spikes in repatriation are preludes to more violence, more displacement, and trouble ahead. And so we want to be very careful. Yes, repatriation is a valuable thing. And yes, returnees are something to be worked on. And integration is connected to repatriation, obviously. If you want to integrate them in a destination country, then repatriation is off the table and vice versa. And these are difficult political decisions that both pro-refugee solidarity advocates and governments, policymakers have to make, right? So all of that is fine. But at the same time, we want to understand that repatriation is often a harbinger of even worse things to come, and is not something that we should necessarily promote as the systemic solution, because it's not a systemic solution, right? Okay, let me stop there. We've been going for about an hour, and maybe we can open it up now to questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Mandić. That was absolutely fascinating. I always love your lectures. I know that there are a lot of questions in the chat. So with that, who would like to go first? Throw your hand up so I can see you. There are quite a lot of people in.
I can't see the chat, so let me, oh, yes, I can. Okay. Should I just?
I don't think anyone's posted in the chat itself. Some people ask, can we get our questions ready? Well, while we're waiting for them, I do have a question for you, not necessarily about the lecture, but about what you're doing next. You have a book that's supposed to be coming out in 2025, also about refugees. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what people can expect to purchase your book?
Yes, thank you. That's very kind of you. So the book is called Bad Refugees: Geopolitics, Stigma, and Forced Migration in the Modern World. And it's a tour of forced migration from World War I until today. And it's looking at how we perceive certain refugee categories as more worthy than others. How do we have greater sympathy for certain forced migrants than others, and why? And the argument is that a lot of this is geopolitical. And I touched on this in points number 2 to some extent, 2 and 3, because a lot of the refugee stuff is kind of pigeonholed as a kind of niche humanitarian pity case thing. And instead, people ask me, what can I do? What can I do? Well, as it turns out, maybe the best thing you can do for refugees is to go do more about foreign policy. Because the foreign policy, international relations side of things, that's where the fire is burning. And that's what the structural causal force, right? The geopolitics is absolutely central to understanding where refugees come from, why they come in such a way, and why it's such a chronic problem. And without addressing that, you're just dealing with symptoms. And so asylum policy and foreign policy are one and the same thing, but we don't really understand that very well. And so we need a lot more people who are doing refugee solidarity stuff to jump into the IR, foreign policy, diplomacy, State Department, et cetera, world, right? In order to get a better understanding. So that's what the book is about. And it's coming with Oxford University Press. And I hope anybody who purchases a book has a coffee on me. Just write me an email.
I'm going to hold you to that, Dr. Mandić, because you know I'm going to purchase the hardcover, as I always do.
It's the modern world, and so you have to, as you know, books are completely unprofitable. And so you have to go deep into but the way it works now is you publish a book and then you go into debt because you have to buy your own book back to give it to your colleagues who helped you write the book, right? And then you have to induce people to buy it. So, but
everybody who came to the presentation today better buy Dr. Mandić's book or you'll be hearing from me. I'm just saying. Just kidding. Anab, you had a question.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful and informative webinar, Professor Mandić. I'm a graduate of sustainability and looking forward to my commencement in May. So coming from my academic background, so I've got two questions for you. One is about what we have always, in our academic settings discussed also, integrating the refugee crisis and their resettlement as part of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, because they definitely, this deserves a separate, place on the table. And secondly, with reference to Syrian refugee crisis, that was, part of which was instigated due to the drought induced intra-national, intra-country migration. So this, brings us to the geopolitical impacts of climate change, so which are very real and, but we don't hear, uh, you know, we don't see it addressed as much as it should be. So what is the progress on that? Or are there any institutions taking it up as a main agenda? And my third question is about your book. Is this book available in South Asian countries? So I'm based out of Pakistan, and a lot of times I have to struggle accessing the books. So is your book available here?
it should be through Oxford somehow, if online.
Okay.
I should hope so. Thank you, Anab, for those questions. So let me quickly, let me go in reverse order. Yes, climate change, you are certainly right to identify climate change as a major, we can think of it as a major new force factor. And there's a budding literature on eco-refugees, eco-migrants, climate refugees, and there's a big story there and there's a big literature, and this will intensify. If by 2050, the climate scientists, the conservative climate scientists tell us that sea level rise will be sufficient to make Bangladesh be underwater, for example. That's how what's the population of Bangladesh? 100 million or something? That's a lot of millions of people who are going to be displaced. And where are they going to go? They're going to go into, right? So we see this everywhere. It's already happening. Already hundreds of thousands of people are eco-migrants in Bangladesh. I think the thing to remember, though, is we shouldn't completely move away from traditional refugees that I have been talking about, traditional forced migrants that I have spoken to you about today, who are fleeing violence and collective violence, for several reasons. One is that climate refugees are still the exception and not the rule. That may change, but today, most people displaced are not fleeing climate change primarily. Yes, you're right. The Syria civil war was preceded by the biggest drought in the history of the Levant, and that was a contributing factor. But you cannot say that they are primarily fleeing drought. They primarily maybe moved a little bit within Syria from some of the areas that were affected by the drought into places like Damascus in Arab Spring 2011, and that contributed to those early protests. But that was a contribution to a minor phase there, and the primary force factor was, of course, Assad's crackdown, and then the war as it ensued, and American and Russian intervention and everything else. So most forced migrants today are fleeing war and ethnic violence and sectarian violence and collective violence, and we need to keep that in mind. And we shouldn't move to a situation where, oh, now we're in a new world and all forced migrants are fleeing climate change, because climate change is very diffuse. Who is to blame for climate change is a very diffuse and open-ended question about Chinese coal mines and everything else. But the question of who is to blame for Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh has a very clear answer. And there's a regime in Burma, Myanmar, who is responsible and deliberately creating the right. Forced migrants are not an accident. Forced migrants are an instrument of war, and they are an instrument of ethnic cleansing. It's not like they're happening accidentally, falling from the sky. And that's a reason to remember forced migrants in the traditional sense. But of course, we're moving towards a world where it may happen in our lifetime. I'm not saying it's not possible, that climate refugees start to outnumber war refugees and violence refugees. And then we should really think about how to recategorize, because what we talk about since World War II, when we say refugee, has nothing to do with climate migration as we know it. And on your first question, yes, there have been a lot of part of the sustainability development, global sustainability paradigm. Thankfully, some people have had the wisdom to bring the refugee question up. And as you say, resettlement and integration are both major kind of proposals for how to take advantage of refugee human capital, because of course refugee human capital is the single biggest argument for thinking about refugees as a development opportunity and not just as a liability, as a problem, as a securitization concern. Let's lock them up, let's control them. We need to move away from that towards an understanding that refugees are a huge opportunity. These are dynamic, entrepreneurial, disproportionately educated, disproportionately well-off people who can be used inside your society for economic growth and everything else. So integration and resettlement. The problem with resettlement is the thing I mentioned. It's a dead end. Less than 1% of the refugees who qualify ever get resettled on average in a given year for decades. Countries do not want to do resettlement. Resettlement numbers are minuscule, and they're going to stay that way. And so people who talk about resettlement as a systemic solution are just, they might as well not offer any solution. If I have a factory and less than 1% of the products coming out of my assembly line are functional, I don't think that factory is doing production. I think it's doing waste production or something else, but that's just not a solution. And on integration, the other, so yes, of course, but again, with this crucial proviso that I mentioned, which is that the overwhelming majority, tens of millions of refugees, are de facto integrated, but not de jure. They are informally integrated, but not formally. And somehow the Global Compact and whatever other initiatives, they have to take that into account. It's not the choice between should we integrate them or they remain unintegrated. It's the choice between, are you going to recognize the reality that actually de facto exists on the ground, that they are part of your city, they are part of that neighborhood, and they are going to be there for a long number of years? Are you going to account for that, or are you going to continue to ignore it, which is the current paradigm? That's the debate. Are you going to formalize the informal integration?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Very quickly, so there's this Jordanian educational reform support program from the World Bank that has lent $700 million to Jordan, and that primarily includes the education reforms for the Syrian refugees. So with that kind of loan that Jordan has borrowed from the World Bank, is it worth it? Did it, yield as per the huge amount? And secondly, okay, so this question may be a bit sensitive, but I don't know any other way to put it. So Jordan has been open to has opened its borders for Syrian refugees, while for Gaza, despite the national the public pressure, the kingdom hasn't been able to do so. So on the official grounds, what is it that prevents them from, hosting the refugees from Gaza?
On official grounds, officially, Palestinians are just sui generis. That's been true since the beginning. They're considered stateless peoples, and they don't qualify. UNHCR, for example, doesn't have a mandate over the Palestinians. There is UNRWA, as you know. The Palestinians are not considered. Peter Maurer was once the Red Cross head, Peter Maurer, was once at Harvard, and he said we have 4 categories. We have illegal migrants in terms of the Red Cross treatment of these migration categories. He said we have illegal migrants, we have labor migrants, we have refugees, and we have Palestinians. And of course, I told him the 4th one, that's the clearest category you got. And he said, oh yeah, that's the clearest one we got. So that's the formality. They just don't in principle qualify. So maybe your question about Jordan is very specific, and we can talk about, of course, the extent to which the Syrian refugees were, they opened their doors is one way to put it. Another way to put it is that it was a forced move because they have a border with this raging Syrian civil war, and they didn't have much of a choice except to open up Azraq and Zaatari and all the rest of it. The funding, yes, certainly, refugees are a tremendous liability, but they're also an asset in the sense that they are an instrument for fundraising. The more refugees you have, the more power you have to go to the international community and say, throw money at us. Look at the right. And Jordan is in many ways idiosyncratic because it has a remarkable camp infrastructure, and it's an encampment society, and it has an official camp policy that you have to be in places like Zaatari. Lebanon, in contrast, doesn't have an encampment policy. It doesn't have refugee camps. It has an anti-camp policy. That has a lot to do with what you're asking about Jordan's international position and its fundraising and how much money it gets or doesn't get. Maybe we can talk about that separately because it's very good. Let's talk some other questions. Some other people had questions.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, so next we'll hear from Bradley. Just real quick on a serious note though, if you find it difficult to get any of Danilo Mandić's books, just let me know and email me and I'll make sure that I will mail them to you. Bradley?
Right. Hello, Mr. Mandić, Dr. Lord Mandić, I'm not quite sure. Thank you very much, by the way, for all this. You're really, I think Mr. Mandić is very well informed in terms of your support. It was really comprehensive, very empathetic, and very using a lot of socialist words. Socialism? No. Words. Your understanding was very comprehensive, so thank you. So in regards to when you mentioned that most refugees are internally displaced, going back to thinking about Live Aid and about our Freddie Mercury, who was a refugee who fled from Zanzibar and really was really headlining it, got well informed. A lot of the aid during Live Aid didn't really go to people who needed it. It went to dictators like Idi Amin, and it really wasn't as helpful as people would have wanted. And this can be a really common situation with countries with very high refugee populations, such as with the Rohingya in Burma, the situation in Tigray. And how can we make sure that aid to people who are internally displaced and internal refugees actually gets to them rather than being usurped by people who maybe aren't as needing of those resources as they could be? I mean, when I was in the DRC, mostly illegally, moving medicine and things like just basic fundamental medicines are very difficult because people who are government ministers would try to take it and resell it, and people who needed it wouldn't get it and would pass away. And this issue is pretty all over the place, really. And you're super well informed about all this, so I was hoping you could shed light on the subject.
You know, Bradley, that's the most difficult question and the most common. It's an excellent problem, and I wish if I had the answer to that, I think I would be heading one of the major humanitarian organizations or something. But the tragedy, as you probably saw in the Congo, if you went to Goma, for example, is precisely that the humanitarian sector has a really hard damned if you do, damned if you don't challenge ahead of it. And there is no good, it's choosing between rotten, evil options all the time. People think that humanitarian aid, including the funding problem, the corruption of funding that you mentioned, is a problem of, people's wishes or something like that. When in reality, on the ground, precisely for the very same reasons that these refugees are fleeing, For the very same reason, the causes of displacement are also the causes of dysfunctional humanitarian aid provision, because you have to go to a border and say, okay, let's go deliver blankets and food and bushels of wheat and medicine to refugees and vulnerable populations. And then some warlord walks up to the border and says, that's an excellent idea. Leave the trucks here and I'll go ahead and distribute them. Trust me. And you say, well, I don't want to leave the trucks here. I would like to go and distribute them myself, says the Red Cross or anyone else. And say, no, but that's not how we do things. Just leave the trucks here and we'll do that. That was the story of Venezuela vis-a-vis the humanitarian convoy with those. You mentioned Freddie Mercury and Live 8. There was a repetition of Live 8 concert on the border with Venezuela, precisely to draw attention to this blockage of humanitarian aid to the starvation in Venezuela. And that's typical, not the concert, but that situation where in order the de facto choice that the humanitarian sector faces, including the refugee one, is between doing nothing on the one hand, or some rotten compromise with somebody on the ground who has blood on their hands, who is going to provide access to them. There's no third way. And so either you do nothing, in which case everybody is going to criticize you and you're just twiddling your thumbs while Gazans are starving, for example, or you have to engage with one belligerent or another. And those belligerents are highly, highly incentivized, given the nature of guerrilla warfare, given the nature of modern warfare, given nationalist fervor, given a lot of things, right? Not because anyone's a psychopath necessarily, although those are often, those are disproportionately represented, of course, in the field, terrorizing refugees, right? But simply because of the situation. Anybody who has trucks of humanitarian aid is instantly going to instrumentalize that for the very same warlordism that's keeping them alive. And so the story of who controls humanitarian aid is a big story of civil wars, whether it's Syria or Yugoslavia or the Congolese wars that you probably know better than me since you worked there, right? And the case of Goma in the Congo, if I can just say, was, I think, a major turning point in the way that refugee humanitarian institutions think about the problem. Because the lesson of Goma, this massive refugee camp turned into a city, basically a city unto itself. It's a kind of refugee city created and sustained by the humanitarian sector, exploited by both the rebels and the government forces. It's the rape capital of the world, Goma. And it consists of refugees whose entire livelihood depends on the humanitarian sector. They work as drivers, they work as bodyguards, they work as translators, they work as prostitutes for the humanitarian presence there. And the catastrophe of Goma was so bad that a lot of the humanitarian sector did a lot of soul searching. And that's why today they talk about things like the humanitarian footprint. That is to say, if we go in there and we, for example, become the major job providers, is that helping or is that only catalyzing the civil war? If we go in there and create an enclave, let's call it, you know, well, I won't go into examples here. I'll just say Rwanda, I'll just say Bosnia-Herzegovina, and maybe you can think of your own examples. But if humanitarians come in and create an enclave, and that incentivizes more violence and empowers one belligerent at the expense of another and prolongs the bloodshed instead of shortening it, did we help or did we maybe unhelp, right? And so this humanitarian footprint problem is, at least, right, the hopeful, optimistic part is that this has become a part of the conversation, and Goma had a lot to do with it becoming a part of the conversation. And so there is a kind of risk-averse, be careful, the road to hell is paved with good intentions attitude, which is in many ways justified. And this is not to detract from your excellent point, Bradley, that the humanitarian aid is often diverted to nefarious actors. Of course it is, and there are entire books about this that I can send to you about this problem. I just want to say that there is really no good alternative, because a lot of times you have to bite the bullet. You don't say it in the press conference. You don't say it in the UN, the report to Brussels or whatever. But behind the scenes, you have to just bite the bullet and accept that 50% of the aid is going to go where it's not supposed to, in order that the other 50% gets somewhere, or you do nothing. So that's the problem. That's the devil's bargain. During the Holocaust, just one example. During the Holocaust, Doctors Without Borders on the one hand, and the International Committee of the Red Cross on the other, split very aggressively. And to this day, they hate each other because they split very aggressively on this particular topic. Should we go into the Nazi camps and try to deliver some semblance of aid to the Jewish prisoners, in which case you become useful idiot propaganda tools for the Nazi regime, or should we do nothing? Because any cooperation of any kind with the Nazi authorities is complicity in those prison camps. What would you like to do? And so they split over this. Doctors Without Borders took one position, and the Red Cross took the other position. And I just want to say that both of those positions are understandable because you're dealing with lesser evils in these situations. There is no easy way where you're going to guarantee that 100% of the aid goes to who needs it. That's never the case. Sorry, Bradley, you wanted to come back on that?
No. Thank you for a very comprehensive answer. It's definitely a case-by-case basis, and it's better to try and do something than to do nothing, but you have to try and mitigate the amount of damage it causes depending on the situation and circumstances. But it's complicated as hell. Thank you very, very much for that. And sorry if I talk too quickly. That's just who I am as a person. But yeah, no, that's really comprehensive answer. Thank you. Very good.
I'm fairly old and still I can follow you. So I think you talk at a good pace.
That's reassuring. Hvala vam. Hvala, I think.
Hvala vama.
Thank you, Bradley. Andra, you've had your hand up for a while. Go ahead with your question.
Hi. So to echo Bradley, Emina did not disappoint. To your credit, Emina, the professor's been very delivered on everything. So I'm gonna give just a bit of backstory just for my question to make sense. My parents emigrated to Italy after the Romanian dictator was decapitated, and they were like, "Yay, let's leave." And I study data science now, and I must say they've been there for like 20 plus years now, and they're citizens now. It's great. I must say I was a bit shocked to see that we have quite diverging opinions, views on the situation of Ukraine right now. And I know it's because of the algorithms.
You and I, or you and your parents?
Me and my parents. Me being in the States right now.
I see.
And them being in Italy, and of course being Romanian Italian in a way, right? So I wonder if you could share your insights, which I'm sure you have. You know, I have my point of view from the data science part, but I would love to hear your point of view from, you know, all your knowledge on how you've seen things shift. For example, I know I've heard content saying how Gen Z are more prone to be pro-Gaza, for example, because they're more on TikTok, and there's like something like 3/4 of the content is pro-Gaza. I don't know if that sparks anything for you.
Not because of TikTok. Yes, it's true that
maybe not. Sure.
Not because of TikTok.
But it was one of the points that was made. But I find this very interesting. So yeah, I just wanted to hear your opinion.
I can't comment on your particular family. Every family is of course different. But there are age effects that are very universal as regards things like risk aversion and things like political conservatism, we could call it. The older people get, the more, on the whole, on average, right? Not everybody, but there is evidence across different societies that are very different from each other that young people tend to be a lot more now liberal conservative are these polluted terms that we don't tend to use anymore. But as applied to things like refugees, yes, certainly younger people are more likely on average to be constituencies compared to like 60, 70, 50-year-olds who are going to be receptive to greater refugee immigration and more accepting of refugee ghettoization and refugee specificity, for example, keeping their own religion, keeping their own culture within the host society is something that is a lot more acceptable to young people than it is to older people. Your question about your friends is kind of interesting because you're a second generation, as it were, refugee family, a second generation refugee child, and there's a literature on this constituency, second, third generation refugee kids. And it varies a lot, and it varies, of course, according the biggest variable is which particular force factor are we talking about? Is it Castro? Is it the Castro regime in Cuba? Millions of Cuban refugees came into the United States, and one of the fascinating findings from the literature on them is that third and fourth generation Cuban refugees take the refugee identity very, very seriously. And they are more fanatically anti-communist, anti-Castro than some of their parents, and they have disagreements along that route. What's called exile ideology in some of the literature, meaning this kind of Manichaean, aggressive pride in being a refugee, is something that is characteristic, not just the Cuba. I just mentioned Cubans because they're not because they're special in that way, but they're an example of one possibility of what happens, and that is that refugeedom in this family context of what stories do I tell my kids? That's an open-ended question, right? Some families decide, survive the Holocaust and never mention anything to their kids for the rest of their lives. Some people displaced in Nakba, 1948 Palestinians, moved to Paris and lie to their children about everything they've been to because they don't want that. They think of that as a burden that they don't want to pass on to their children. Other forced migrants aggressively insist that their children and their great-great-grandchildren remember Nakba, including in very romanticized, idealized, aggressive nationalist ways. Or remember Palestine from the Jewish perspective, whatever it may be. Remember life before Castro. Remember Bosnia before the Yugoslav wars, right? And they pass this on to their children, and they make it a part of the family folklore and intimacy. And a lot of this, of course, is trauma talk and the intergenerational transmission of trauma, collective traumas being transmitted through fantasies of return to the homeland, even though the homeland doesn't exist anymore. But you have these great-grandchildren who believe in the homeland as a central part of their identity, and that has a lot, right? So that's one possible outcome. Another possible outcome is that the refugee experience in other cases gets stigmatized and demonized and treated as something like a handicap. And so the children pick up on that and prefer to distance themselves from their parents or grandparents or whoever it may be. And the way to distance themselves is to integrate even more aggressively in the culture that they find themselves in. So, for example, there's a study of Indo-Chinese refugees in the 1970s in the United States. And there's Laotians and Cambodians and Vietnamese. And there's very interesting differences between between the different nationalities fleeing different situations. Some of them became more American than the Americans. They integrated so well that they're outperforming the Americans in the schools. They are doing better in the labor market. They're doing better on income. They're better Americans than the Americans. And they overcome the nativist bigotry against them by outperforming the Americans at their own game. Others, we're talking about kids. We're not talking about first-generation refugees who went through the experience itself. We're talking about kids of refugees who grew up with refugee parents. Others from Indochina go in the direction of withdrawal and dissociation and rejection of American values and rejection of American society, rejection of money and materialism and individualism. And they double down on the Cambodian identity. They double down on collectivist cultural values. They double down on tribal specificities from Khmer Khmer culture, which they don't even remember because they were born in Queens. So these things are, it's not just refugees, of course. This is the construction of kind of national identity for immigrants in general is this way, but that's one possible way there's a great variety. And of course
or if I may, now you made me realize I am, I guess, the third possibility, which I retracted from the Italian, rejected the Romanian.
I wasn't necessarily talking about you. So what I would say about you, that the few details that I have is, so they fled Ceausescu. So these are kind of Cold War, there's Cold War refugees. And the Ukraine thing now is funny because a lot of people who are these kind of old Cold Warriors are taking a position very pro-Ukraine and anti-Russia, but other people who are Cold Warriors in the sense of despising communism, hating the Soviet bloc, are nevertheless less sympathetic to Ukraine because they see this new Russian nationalist Putin thing as an alternative to that Soviet Union that they despised and somehow got right. So there's a variety there too. And your family may be, I don't know any research on that. Your family may be special in that regard. Maybe it's not special in that regard. But there's no doubt that the Ukrainian mess deserves our attention, and that the Russian aggression is certainly one of the, even though these are white people, and even though America also invaded countries, that doesn't mean that Russian imperialism and aggression is also not a terrible thing. And we need to acknowledge that if we're going to be realistic. They are intentionally they are displacing people. They're one of these, the Russian military is a perfect example of that thing that I mentioned, that refugees are not an accident. They are a deliberate policy of control, of cleansing a territory of a population that you deem undesirable in order to annex it, for example. The Russians are proactively doing that.
Thank you both. Are there any additional questions for this lecture? Going once, going twice. I mean, okay, we went a little bit over, but what a fascinating discussion. Oh, we do have a question. Okay, Arvind, go ahead.
Great session, sir. I really enjoyed this one, and it's a very topical one. I just wanted to ask you, how would you handle economic migrants separately from the political refugees and the forced refugees, people who move because they just want a better life, they see a lack of economic opportunity, and they pay like $30,000-$40,000 sometimes, just to get to the United States or to Europe. They pay these coyotes.
Yes.
Huge. So yeah, these are the elites of the refugees, and in that sense, then maybe the really I don't know how you would define deserving. All of these are deserving people, but the really poorer, maybe Yemeni or Sudanese refugees don't even get a refugee visa because all these slots are taken up by the elite refugees. I don't know how to call it. So I always have that struggle in my mind. Are these people coming in the most deserving, or I mean, all of them do deserve our support, but as an academic or as a business policy or a government policy, how would you differentiate?
Oh, if only the government policy was, if the government policy was at all rational, if it was at all evidence-based or data-driven, it would certainly not engage in this kind of, what we have now is, almost total restrictionism on the asylum side and on the refugee side. I include the United States in this, even though the United States boasts of being the highest kind of refugee host society in terms of resettlement. at about 100,000. It peaked at 200,000, then Trump brought it down to like 10,000, and then it went right. Of course, that's a drop in the bucket compared to what Kenya, compared to what Poland took, compared to what Turkey took, because of the curse of geography. So, you know, what you say is completely true, but it's kind of an understatement, because things are even worse than that. If you look at the forced migration spectrum in total, the vast majority of them, as I said, are never going to cross an international border. They are somewhere within the territory, sometimes coming back to where they are and then getting kicked out again. And there's a lot of cyclical, and there's a lot of secondary displacement. So they're displaced once, and then they come back, they're displaced again because Daesh replaces the first thing, and so on. So that's 80% of it. And so those people are completely outside of the refugee regime. They're completely outside. The Refugee Convention doesn't cover them. And of course, they are living in danger. And that's why we need to understand that they are the most vulnerable. The people that cross an international border are a subset that is disproportionately well educated, disproportionately well off. It's expensive to be a refugee. You need to pay a smuggler, for example. And a smuggler is very, very expensive, let alone the ones that come to the wealthy societies, which are a subset of a subset of a subset, right? A very small, minuscule selected group, let alone the resettled ones who are like winning the lottery ticket. Now, the resettled ones are absolutely vulnerable, because the UNHCR makes sure to pick the most vulnerable category from the Congo, for example. Most refugees in the United States are Congolese. They're from the Congo. And so they are vetted for being extremely vulnerable and targeted. But again, less than 1% of the total pool is resettled. And so what you have is government migration policy, which is predominantly about economic migrants. Your question was about labor and economic migration. And we got to remember that in the big umbrella of migration, 90% of it is economic, or 95%, or whatever it may be, is labor migration. Is, you know, students coming to Harvard, and Mexican agricultural workers going for American agribusiness in the U.S. South, or Filipino maids working in the Middle East, or whatever. You know, that's the hundreds of millions of labor migrants, right? Here we're talking about a small subset of people who have very little in common with those people, who are about 100 million. And most of them never cross an international border, and they are more like prisoners of war, civilians, and so on, stuck and extremely endangered, life and death danger. And they face different challenges from the challenges faced by economic migrants. And so by international law, refugees should be a VIP category, because their acceptance in the society is not conditional on labor market demand or on your program, right? It's just whether they are being persecuted according to the Refugee Convention, and whether they have a case. And so states are eagerly avoiding this. They're avoiding this by non-arrival policies, which interdictions, for example, with boats off the coast of the US, or penalizing travel carriers who end up smuggling migrants across borders, forced migrants across borders from Central America, for example, or things like Remain in Mexico policy, which is a way of blocking deserving asylum seekers coming within a larger set of labor migrants and mixed migrants and all kinds of other things, right? It's a way of blocking, in quotation marks, real deserving refugees from even entering your territory, because as long as they don't enter your territory, you don't owe them anything. If they do enter your territory, including sovereign waters, under international law, as a signatory of the Refugee Convention and the 1967 Protocol, you are obligated to give them a fair due diligence, due process with a lawyer and a translator and perhaps a clinician psychologist to verify whether they are indeed being persecuted by Burundian death squads. States are avoiding doing that. And so your question is great, but I wish we could approach it. We can't even come to your question, because the a priori policy is to just block everybody without even question, right? If countries in a parallel universe if the wealthy societies were interested in helping refugees, which they're not, they would open asylum bureaus in the embassies of the countries abroad. Did you ever ask yourself why Honduran and Salvadoran and Guatemalan asylum seekers show up on the Texas border to claim asylum? Because they have no other mechanism to claim asylum except by showing up at your territory. But showing up at your territory is illegal. So how is an asylum seeker supposed to? You see, the international refugee regime is kind of like saying you have freedom of speech, but saying what you want is illegal, and writing down what you want is illegal, and blogging what you want is illegal, and getting somebody else to say it for you is also illegal, and getting up on a soapbox and singing it is illegal, and writing it anonymously is illegal, and using sign language is illegal. And then at some point, but you have the right to freedom of speech. Well, at some point you think to yourself, if I have the right to freedom of speech, but every possible avenue for me actually to realize that right is criminalized, do I really have the right to freedom of speech? That's asylum rights today. Asylum rights today exist on paper, and states pay lip service to the idea of believing in the Refugee Convention that they are signatories of. But in practice, they are criminalizing every possible avenue for those tens of millions of people to actually realize their asylum rights. And the major way they do that is conflating economic migrants with asylum seekers, which is what you raised the question about, right? The easiest way is to just say they're not asylum seekers, they're labor migrants. They're lying, or they're misrepresenting themselves, or they're not as educated as the other ones, or they don't fit into the labor, right? There's different versions of this, but one of the key instruments of state restrictionism is to treat asylum seekers, genuine asylum seekers, as economic labor migrants, because you kick out the economic labor migrants more easily, right?
Sir, just
Last
a quick follow-up
question.
question. Just
Sorry,
a quick follow-up.
I have to run. I see
all right.
Anthony is waiting.
Yeah, sure.
We can continue this on email. Just one last question, and then I have to run.
Okay, Anthony, you're the last question.
Yeah, thank you so much. You're already touching on this on your answer to the last couple of questions. My question was more about an open-ended question about the use of refugees as political pawns and bargaining chips by people within both sides of the conflict, oftentimes where the political advantage is maintaining their refugee status or creating refugees in order to build a particular strength or whatever particular side of a conflict there is. If you can expand more upon the abuse of that refugee status through the conflict by using them as political bargaining chips.
Yes, well, that's an excellent question, Anthony. And I think the best way to understand how this works is to look at the literature on, for example, how hostages are used as bargaining chips, how trapped civilians who didn't migrate are used as bargaining chips, so the Civil War literature, the literature on war and modern war and guerrilla warfare and asymmetric warfare and terrorism, if you want to use that category, right, is very kind of clear on the notion that for a variety of structural reasons, it pays for belligerents, non-state actors as well as states, to in one way or another contain or trap or control a civilian population, and then to use that control as leverage, not just in the war in the sense of the battleground, but in sense of diplomatic recognition, in the sense of attracting international aid, in the sense of buying legitimacy in the locality, and for various other ways, right? In extremes, this is ethnic cleansing. The capacity to do ethnic cleansing and to show that you are ready to do it is a tremendous instrument, is a tremendous tool. Daesh was absolutely spectacular. How did Daesh take on a territory the size of Belgium or whatever it was across Syria, Iraq? It did it by simply following up on the very simple idea that we're just gonna expel them. We're not bounded by any cut, right? And people are caught off guard by this. And many states, including this and You can talk about other examples like that, right? So using refugees is one, I would say, subcategory of that general kind of behavior. It's one thing if you go into a village and say, this village is now fill in the blank. Whatever your favorite, this village is used to be Shia, now it's Sunni. This village is Turkey, now it's Kurdistan. Or this village was Kurdistan, now it's Turkified, right? This village was Croatia, now it's Serbia. This village was Serbia, now it's Croatia. That kind of, right? It's one thing to just walk into the village and say that. It's quite another thing to say that and then expel 50% of the population, 70% of the villagers. How about the whole village? Because then everyone sees that you mean business. And then in a very real sense, you have materialized on what you promised. And suddenly you become a stakeholder and you become somebody that everyone has to deal with. That's what a lot of warlordism in the Middle East and Africa is about. It's about who has the gall to expel great numbers of people, gets a certain credibility. Now, it's not the kind of credibility at Harvard University that we cherish, but in the world of war and collective violence, that is a kind of credibility. Now, the second answer to your question, and then we'll stop. There is also the question of refugees being used as bargaining chips. What I said so far is about refugees being used as bargaining chips by belligerents on the ground, actors on the ground. There is also the question of use of refugees as bargaining chips by destination societies. So Turkey, at the peak of the migration crisis, as you may know, people in Erdogan's circle began to realize that being the greatest refugee host nation in the world is not just a disaster and a huge liability. And what are we going to do with is it 5, is it 6 million people? They also began to realize that it's also a tool for blackmail. And so they approached the European Union and Merkel at the time and said, we have the power to be a buffer state and to stop. We have the power to turn off the faucet and to prevent further refugee flow into Greece and then through the Balkan route into Western Europe. We have the power to do that. And we also have the power to open up the faucet, to open up the floodgate, and to flood the Mediterranean with little refugee baby corpses washing up on tourist resorts. And it looks very, very bad in the media. We have the power to do that. And so give me $5 billion of aid going to Turkey for the humanitarian services, right? Which I'm very glad that went to that. Don't get me wrong. And then give me accelerated accession into the EU process for Turkey, which had been stalled for a long time. And then give me this concession at the NATO, and then give me that concession. And then, so I'm talking about the March 2016 EU-Turkey deal that closed the Balkan route and terminated the massive flow of refugees into Germany and elsewhere, was a result of the Turkish government using refugees as bargaining chips. And that's how it works. And that's a common, and I just want to say that Turkey is not inventing this. The history of refugee waves is the history of governments using their refugee populations as bargaining chips. And it's been that way since in World War II, the Allied forces were trading Jewish refugees for the Germans, the Axis forces were trading Jewish refugees for German POWs from British imperial territory, and the British were taking them and putting them into Palestine when they could and liberating them when they could, and a lot of times they couldn't. And so that's war. And refugees are just one of many pawns in that regard. They're not the only pawns, but you're absolutely right. And the way you formulated the question is, I think, the proper framing of the issue, because it draws attention to the force factor, which we often forget. Okay, shall we wrap it up? I have to, unfortunately.
Dr. Mandić, thank you so much for being with us today. This was
Thank you,
absolutely
Amina. It's been a pleasure, and I hope it was helpful to some people, and we'll be in touch by email.
Thank you. Yes, over 50 people RSVP'd and over 40 people showed up for this, which was our biggest event of the year thus far. I want to thank you so much. And I'm so glad that so many people are interested in this topic because, you know, sometimes people don't like to talk about it, but it's very important. So I want to thank you for your time. Again, everyone, his books are available on Amazon in paperback, Kindle, and hardcover. I highly recommend them. I own them all, and I just think everyone should read them. So with that, Dr. Mandić, thank you so much.
Thank you, Amina. You're very kind. Thank you, guys. All the best. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.